Friends, thank you all for being here this morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Andrew Schwartz, and I have the honor of hosting and being the moderator for today's consultation. It's the first in the series. The Center for Earth Ethics is hosting to support the goals of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I'm deeply grateful to our partners in this work and for everyone who's given support, which includes the Faith for Earth Initiative, Break Free from Plastic, and support from the UN Decade team. We wouldn't be here with all of your input into this process, onto this important conversation. This series of consultations that we're doing will be a series that will be put into a handbook and a guidebook that goes towards shaping the decade's approach to ecosystem restoration. And we will also be creating opportunities for local communities to do this in their own space based off of all the things that we learned through this. So please join us through all these different consultations. This first consultation focuses on air and air pollution in St. James Parish in Louisiana in the United States, which is also known as Cancer Alley. St. James Parish is an 80-mile stretch along the Mississippi River in the American South between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. In that 80 miles, there are nearly 150 petrochemical plants and refineries. 150. It drives cancer rates in the area to be 50 times higher than the average. And the chemicals in the air also cause respiratory issues, can affect childhood development, and a litany of other health issues, including rashes for children who spend too much time outside. The problems we're seeking to solve today with the climate crisis and with the triple planetary crisis are not simply a question of mechanics, but they're a question of the heart. Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, said, we need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. It's why we're hosting these conversations through the lens of values, spirituality, and culture. I remain convinced that we cannot properly engage ecosystem restoration projects that are going to help mitigate the climate crisis unless we are engaging questions of the soul and how our communities and societies engage with one another and with the earth. St. James Parish has known too much death and violence. Colonialism and the doctrine of discovery fueled the massacre and attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples in the region. Following them came the horrors of slavery and the forced labor camps that stole millions of Africans from their homelands to suffer under abusive hands. Now, built on generations of racist and exploitative policies, are these petrochemical facilities and refineries, which are almost always placed into predominantly Black communities. Casey, I was reading an interview that you gave, and it made me think of this quote from Maya Angelou, where she says, if you're not angry, then you're either a stone or you're too sick to be angry. You should be angry about these things, but you must not be bitter. Bitterness is like a cancer. It eats upon the host, and it doesn't do anything to the object of its displeasure. So use that anger, yes. You write it, you paint it, you dance it, you march it, you vote it, you do everything about it. You talk it. Never stop talking it. Today, we have 4 incredible women who are doing everything about this plastic pollution problem. They're at home resisting and working on policy issues, trying to stop this problem where it starts and cleaning up along the way. There's so much work to do here, and I'm so excited for this opportunity to be here. And so with that introduction, I want to hand it over to you, Casey Camp, to open up this conversation. Casey, you're an environmental ambassador, matriarch, and hereditary drumkeeper of the Ponca Nation of Oklahoma. Can you reflect a little bit on this question of resistance? Because we know that ecosystem restoration, this work of climate, resolving the climate crisis, are in different steps of the process. And in St. James Parish, and then this work of plastic pollution, so much is predicated around this act of resistance, of stopping this problem in its tracks so that we can engage in the recovery that needs to happen, both for the earth and for our communities and for ourselves. And so I would hope that you could share a bit of your reflections on this piece around resistance in this enduring problem of America of outright exploitation and violations of human rights and the rights of nature. Over to you.
Latia, Witike, Banka Abde, Mashte Banka, Oklahoma. Good morning. It's good to be here with everyone. As you can tell, I'm on a satellite internet with a very limited connection. So please overlook that. I'm going to turn off my video to help strengthen that. But that's also a sign of the inequities of what we're talking about with Black, brown, and red people. My people were forcibly removed to this occupied territory of Oklahoma at the time my grandpa was 6 years old. I live on the occupied territory that belonged to where the Wakanda, the Great Spirit, placed the Wichita people. And after that, after the forced removal of the Cherokee on a Trail of Tears, then it became Cherokee Strip. And still that wasn't enough for the colonial government. So they put 39 more tribes here on top of that occupation. So resistance is our existence. It sounds very trite, but at the same time, our ability to actually continue to exist is because we have resisted the colonial mindset, many of us, that was forced on us, that so many of our people had stripped from them when we were kidnapped to boarding schools. My mother was kidnapped when she was 6 and didn't escape until she was 15. And when you're kidnapped from your own home, your own language, your own way of being, your own relationship with our one true mother we all share, the Mother Earth, the Father Sky, then you develop this thing that is that syndrome that they talk about, that Stockholm Syndrome, where you have to begin to identify with your kidnapper in order to even exist. Many of us were capable and deliberately did not fall into those cracks. I'm at the age of 74, was witness to the powerful resistance that was happening during the times of Martin Luther King in the 60s. And it became the impetus for what we called the Red Power movement, what we recognized as a time to lift the voice of the Red Nations, to be able to say, just a moment here. There is a deeper relationship than the one that you are forcing us to participate in by losing our language, by losing our culture, by losing our land base, by forgetting our relationship with the sacred water herself and the breath that is now endangered in St. James Parish, as well as here where I live right now. We are being forced into, I remember a time there was no plastic. I'm that age. I remember a time when there was air to breathe. I remember the times that my grandparents, my mother, my father told us that we must think about the 7 generations to come, or else we are failing to honor our ancestors, because they're the reasons. They prayed us into life. They prayed us into a way of being that gave us away. So we were part of the American Indian movement, demanding civil rights. And in saying that we are human, which, by the way, a Ponca, which I'm of the Ponca Nation, was the first Native American to be deemed a human under the eyes of the laws in the late 1800s. That's how far we have continued to resist, because it is the only way to recognize that we are not just land defenders and water protectors. We are nature, us humans. We are nature. If you eat, if you drink, if you breathe, you are part of all that is, and that's our original teachings. And it is coming back around into the consciousness of what's called America and the global awareness that we cannot, when you say we want to be part of the healing of both Mother Earth and of humans, do not believe that separation. Without her and her gifts, without the sacred air, the breath of the winds, humans as a species will become extinct. And our gift is to ourselves and the generations to come. When we say plastics will not be something that we will tolerate anymore, that these refineries and these defilers, these mass murderers, these serial killers have to be called out for who they are, the oligarchs of the Americas and China and all of those others. And I think I'm just getting started, but I know there's incredible wisdom that I want to listen to. So thank you for this moment. I'm grateful to be among you.
Thank you, Casey. And you, I'm going to follow up on that illusion, the delusion that we're separate from nature later on, because I think that piece is such an important one, and I want to make sure to come back to that, because so much of this divide, so much of this exploitation comes from this vantage point of somehow it's other and that we are part. And if we want to get into the Dominion theology and this doctrine of discovery and how that has laid this groundwork for where we are, I'll be happy to stay on much longer, because it's just such an important conversation point. But I want to move now, Sharon, to you. You live in St. James Parish. You've done so much work there. I want to hear a little bit about that story. I want to get into what's happening there, but also recognizing that right now you're in Charlotte, North Carolina, getting ready to how do you say it? Go yell at Bank of America, who continues to fund this insanity, right? And I think that's part of the piece, right? There's this work of restoration is constant, and so please, over to you to share more of your story in this fight.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. As he said, I'm Sharon Levine from St. James, Louisiana. I'm the director and founder of a faith-based grassroots organization called Rise St. James. This organization came about because Formosa Plastics, a $9.4 billion industry, was planning to be built 2 miles from my home on the West Bank in St. James in Cancer Alley. St. James is in the center of Cancer Alley with that stretch of 85 miles between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. In St. James, in the 5th district, we have 12 refineries and industries within a 10-mile radius. And I didn't know we had that many until 2015, when I joined this other organization, and I found out a whole lot that was going on. And then our governor in April of 2018 announced that he approved Formosa Plastics to come into St. James, and now they call it the Sunshine Project. So he didn't even consult with the citizens of St. James Parish. He consulted with the politicians. And we are people too. The politicians sometimes make decisions that's not right for the people. So that's when we went to fight. We started to fight in October of 2018, and we've been fighting ever since. And so far, Formosa is not building so far. And today we're going to target Bank of America and ask them not to fund Formosa Plastics. And we're going to tell them why not to fund Formosa Plastics. Because if Formosa comes into St. James, it will be a death sentence for us, because people there already sick. So many have died, mostly from cancer. The air is so toxic until when you walk out your door at 6:30 in the morning, you will get a whiff of that dirty air. So in order for us to live, we have to breathe clean air, because people are constantly getting sick. So that's why we started Rise St. James, and we had a whole lot of people that came aboard to join with us, especially the organizations in New Orleans, St. John the Baptist Parish, and different parishes in the area of Cancer Alley. So we wrote letters to the governor, we wrote letters to the parish council members, we did marches, we did town hall meetings, we did whatever we thought that could be done to stop this plant. So far, it haven't been built yet, so we must be doing something right. So we spoke with Jamie Pinkham from the Civil Rights of Economic Development, I think, and he came down to talk to the Army Corps of Engineers in New Orleans, and he met with the citizens of St. James Parish, and they ordered them to do an EIS. So that's almost like 2 years. So they will be on hold at least for 2 years. And also, Michael Regan came down in November last year also to speak to the citizens, not the politicians. So some of them were angry because they spoke with us. The people poured out their hearts and told them what was going on in St. James and how many people had cancer and how many people are dying. So they poured out their hearts, and he listened, and he walked down the streets with us to see all the industries that's in St. James. He didn't see all of them, but he saw the worst ones. And he also went to a place called Burdenland, and there are 2 industries that's on east side of this street. People are dying rapid. You can go down that street and find a husband and wife have cancer. This other lady died with cancer, and this other one died with cancer. The woman's daughter have cancer, her son have cancer. So how many more people do they need to die? Do they want to die by bringing these industries in? And some of the people in Birdland went to the plants and asked them to buy them out, and the plant said no. They already bought out the people that they wanted to buy out. They bought out the whites, and the blacks are still there. And we have a few whites that's there that's fighting along with Rise St. James. So all we want to do is breathe clean air, and we want to live a productive life, and we want to drink clean water. But the main thing is how you're going to live if you can't breathe clean air. You're breathing chemicals. They had a little spill Sunday, I was told, but I didn't pass in front of the plant to smell it. I was at home. But before that, in February, we had a ammonia leak or some kind of chemical leak. They called the sheriff department in St. James to come see about it. It was so strong, they couldn't stay there. So they left. But I was out of town on that day. But we have those leaks often. They don't alert the parish council. The day after Hurricane Ida, we had an oil spill at Marathon right next to Birdland, and they didn't even contact the authorities until after I did a live stream on them. So the next live stream I plan to do is they have cattle on that property eating the grass. You know, the chemicals is in the grass. So my next live stream will be, would you eat that beef? I wouldn't, because you don't know what chemicals these animals are eating, and you don't know where they bring the animals to be slaughtered. So that's my next fight. But today we're going to Bank of America to target them and ask them to divest, denounce, and defund for most of plastics. So that's what we want to do today. And I guess they'll have live stream, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure they will. So thank you.
No, thank you, Sharon. Thank you for everything you're doing down there. I mean, we're going to get, I want to ask you more of this later, the sense of tragedy and joy. Where do we find it, right? And how do we keep it moving and going? And I think that's a big piece, especially right now. Yes. Climate grief and anxiety. You know, there's a lot of pieces here. And I think that's where I want to, as we move now to you, Judith. Judith, thank you. The president of Beyond Plastics. You're also doing some work at Bennington College right now. And, you know, the way I think of this, like, we've got the local fights, right? And then we've got this kind of national piece. And then Jane, we're going to get to you because you've been doing a lot of the international work. But on these national pieces, on this policy piece, Judith, you served as a regional administrator for Region 2 of the EPA. And so you saw the whole suite of what's going on across all these different climate issues. I'm curious why you chose plastics as a focus point, and then why is this legislation piece so important? I know you're pushing the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act right now, and how is that going to help St. James Parish and then the country in this fight as a whole?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be with this distinguished group. And I feel like what I have to share is so insignificant compared to what we've heard prior. I did work at EPA during the Obama administration. So Sharon, I'm really happy that EPA administrator currently, Michael Regan, made it to your community. And I think that says a lot. When I worked at the EPA, I was always pushing my colleagues to go out and meet with communities that are directly affected by pollution. And my advice was listen with the intent to hear. Because in regulatory agencies, there is a tendency to just kind of look at the numbers. Does this permit meet this numeric goal? But we've got to talk to and really integrate what it's like living in these facilities. I do a lot of work with a local organization. We're fighting to shut down a very polluting hazardous waste incinerator next to public housing in upstate New York. And that's one incinerator that's poisoning a community. Sharon, what you were dealing with, 150 petrochemical facilities, is just astonishing. So to answer Andrew's question, why did I decide to kind of rearrange my whole life to work on plastics? I've always loved solid waste issues. And the reason is because it's clear evidence that we are not sustainable. You meet a lot of climate deniers. You don't meet a lot of plastic pollution deniers because the evidence is everywhere. When I was in college, I did an internship and worked to get New York's bottle bill established, the law that puts deposits on beverage containers. And then I worked in the environmental community and worked to shut down a very polluting garbage incinerator in downtown Albany, New York, called the Albany Answers Plant. It is in a low-income, predominantly Black neighborhood. It would have been shut down years ago if it was in a more affluent community. The way we got it shut down, working with the community, was one night we got lucky and the air pollution, the winds were going in a different direction than usual. So the air pollution headed over to the governor's mansion. So a newly fallen white snow was covered with Black particulate matter. And suddenly the governor of New York at the time, Mario Cuomo, paid attention. We got that incinerator shut down. It was a long time ago. It was when we still talked about environmental racism rather than environmental justice. And I think that's an interesting conversation to have. So eventually I weaved my way to the EPA, and there was one statistic on plastics that just really stuck with me. A lot of plastic that gets into the ocean is street litter that goes into rivers and then the ocean. And by 2025, for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, it is predicted there will be 1 pound of plastic. And that statistic just stopped me in my tracks. We are turning our oceans into unpermitted landfills with enormous public health implications. You know, fish are a source of protein for most of the world. And most seafood, particularly seafood that you eat whole, has microplastics in it. Microplastics are everywhere. It's in our air, it's in drinking water, it's in honey, it's in beer, and it's in our bodies. The plastics industry is telling us the solution is recycling. That's not true. Paper and cardboard, for instance, has a 66% recycling rate. Plastics has an 8.5% recycling rate. And we'll be coming out with a report soon documenting it's even less than that. The plastics industry is finally admitting that recycling, which I strongly support for lots of materials, but plastic recycling is, I'll just say, a fib. Last week, I was just calling it a lie. But plastics recycling just doesn't work for a bunch of reasons. So now the plastics industry is pushing something called chemical recycling, which is actually plastic burning. Again, these polluting facilities are located in low-income communities and communities of color. So I work on plastics because of my concern with environmental racism. I focus on the production of plastic, the use, and disposal. And I think people want to see change. There was a recent poll commissioned by Oceana. 81% of American voters want to see local, state, and federal policies to reduce plastics. So many in the environmental community and the anti-plastics world are supporting a federal bill called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. This bill, among other things, would establish a moratorium on the permitting of new or expanded plastic petrochemical facilities. I think that's one of the most important elements of the bill. It also does a national ban on plastic bags. We've got plastic bag bans in a number of states, and a shift to reusable bags, and also a national bottle bill. So this is Senate Bill 984. If you feel like contacting your US Senator, the sponsor is Jeff Merkley from Oregon, who we love. And it's House Bill HR 2238. So the next time I'm up speaking, feel free to go to your phone and call or text your senator or House member and urge them to support and co-sponsor the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act.
Thank you, Judith. So important. And this piece around personhood, this piece around human rights, I mean, I think this is something that often gets lost in, like, we can only do this to the earth if we're willing to do it to one another. And just this outright racism and classism that leads to these things needs to be front and center in this conversation. And I'm so glad that you raised it up the way you did. And so, Jane, zooming out now into the international. And I know you live in New Orleans, so this isn't a far away thing for you. Like, this is just down the road, what's going on. And so with that in mind, I mean, you were an advocate working with the negotiators on, I just lost my notes, the End Plastic Pollution Towards a Legally Binding Instrument that passed at the UN Environmental Assembly 5 conference that happened in Nairobi this year. Can you share a bit about that treaty, why it matters, both for the international community as well as for local communities? And then kind of, this piece of this is about a back home issue for you. So how does this weave in this personal, all these different pieces for you?
Thanks for that, Andrew. And I just want to join the chorus of amazing women on this call saying how honored we are to be among each other. I am always glad to be gathered virtually and in person with the folks here. And thank you, Andrew, for putting this call together in the Center for Earth Ethics. It's interesting, Judith, to hear you talk about plastic pollution deniers. There are no people who are denying plastic pollution, at least not that I've spoken to, but there are certainly people who, as you say, are denying what is the root cause of our plastic pollution crisis, and who want to insist that plastic is only a litter problem. And I think hearing from not just that sort of understanding of the oceans as an unlicensed landfill, but also hearing from folks like Miss Casey and Miss Sharon and myself, who are living in these areas on the front lines of where the production of plastics is happening and how that is affecting people long before this material even has a chance to become a litter problem or waste. Regardless of whether or not we tomorrow solve the world's litter problem, Ms. Sharon and I are still going to be breathing in the air from these plastic production facilities unless we do something to address this problem. And Andrew's right. I actually have lived my whole life in Louisiana. I've been a permanent resident of this state since I was born. I'm 5th generation Louisiana. My husband is also 6th or 7th generation Louisiana. So we go way back here and all of our family roots are here. We mentioned this idea of Cancer Alley, this formation of a geographic stretch along the Mississippi River where people are and have been for many generations now getting sick from the exploitation of labor, from industrial agriculture, and now from both the exploitation of labor and industrial agriculture and petrochemicals. And that I grew up on one end of that stretch in Baton Rouge and now live on the other end in New Orleans, and Miss Sharon is somewhere in between those two places. But that stretch of chemical plants no longer is contained to that 85 miles along the Mississippi River. We're actually seeing the last 3 or 4 decades, we've seen a build out that goes all the way from the southeastern tip of Louisiana down in Plaquemines Parish, which is the ancestral lands of the Homa people and the Choctaw, Chitimacha, Biloxi, Tunica tribes. And we see that go all the way across southern Louisiana and all the way down southern Texas through Houston and Galveston and Corpus Christi. We're talking about a 700-mile stretch where the people along that stretch are being harmed and exploited. And Miss Judith, hearing you talk about the plastics as a means to talk about other things, that's really how I see my work. And that is one of the frames and lenses that I am bringing to this work on the treaty. So I have the unique position of being able to work against plastic production in my home, a place that I love and have no idea what to do if we lose it. And I get to work on that at the international level. We get to go to the United Nations, which is something that I'm still excited about, but I'm also hearing both Andrew's frame on this conversation and Ms. Casey's introduction. The United Nations itself is not a perfect institution. It is a problematic institution from its roots. Something like 80 countries have achieved independence since the rules around the United Nations were formed, and we have not revisited a lot of those rules. So, and a lot of the ways that countries relate to each other, there are vestiges of colonialism in plastic production, in plastic use, and in the structure of the United Nations. So we are doing this treaty negotiation in an imperfect structure, but it's what we have now. And in the process of working on the negotiation, we are doing our best to name that and try to make it, a really responsive and participatory place for civil society. So a little bit about the treaty. We, as Andrew mentioned, coming out of the recent United Nations Environment Assembly, which was at the beginning of March of this year, we got agreed, 175 countries around the world agreed to begin negotiating a legally binding treaty on plastics. Specifically, it's framed around plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Plastics are not just a marine issue. And so even moving ourselves out of just the marine environment around plastics is a pretty big feat. Andrew, you and I were talking previously about the Sustainable Development Goals that this touches. Some of the folks on the call are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that were negotiated as part of the Agenda for 2030 under the UN auspices. We always hear plastic pollution talked about as a part of SDG 14, which is the life below water. It's actually the only place where marine litter is mentioned in the SDGs. But if you look at those sustainable development goals and you take 1 second to step back and think about plastics as an issue, it's so multifaceted. It's an issue of sustainable consumption and production, which is SDG 12. It's an issue of inequality, which we've already talked about significantly here, which is SDG 10. It's an issue of sustainable cities and communities, because in order to really solve this problem, we're going to have to rethink the structure of our communities. That's SDG 11, right? It's also an issue of health. That's SDG 3, right? And even as we think about where plastics come into our lives, for a lot of us around the world, plastics enter our lives, well, everywhere, but really they enter our lives through the food system, through the ways that we buy and purchase food for our families. And if we think about in many countries around the world, who does most of the shopping and who has to think about plastics and bringing that into your household, this is also a gender issue. And that's SDG 5. So we're talking about many, many facets of life that plastics touch, that plastics both harm, and that we have an opportunity and frankly, a responsibility to address in the plastics treaty. Now, is the treaty going to be our perfect vision of what we want for this agreement? No. But what we do have in the resolution and the mandate is a focus on mandatory obligations. That's big, requiring countries to do things. It's not just voluntary. It's not it's something that countries can off the top avoid. It doesn't mean they won't try to avoid it, which we're going to do our best to advocate and work with them. But the mandate also makes reference to coordinating with the existing international agreements on climate existing international agreements on the waste trade, existing international agreements on biodiversity, which are very key to us having a conversation about the full life cycle of plastics, and not just focusing on the ocean issues. And last but certainly not least, there's also references to the human health and well-being aspect. And in many ways, the conversation is also about human rights. You know, I heard Ms. Sharon say this and Ms. Casey, we have the right to clean air. We have the right to clean water. That is not something that is given to us by the government. Y'all, by the very fact that we are alive and breathe the air and drink the water, we have a right to have clean air and clean water. That is a well-established international norm. I can't believe we even had to write that down, but we did, and we have those rights. And it's important that this treaty and all of our work at the local, the hyper local level and the global level reinforce that we have a right to clean air, clean water, a healthy environment. And frankly, just to bring it back before I hand it back to Andrew, we also have a right to freedom from discrimination. And right now, we are hearing that the way that these plants are built, that the way that the global waste trade is being dealt with, that the way that even the chemical recycling solution or false solution that Judith mentioned, even the way that's being built out, it is inequitable, it is colonial, and it is an injustice. And we have a right to not be discriminated against. And these are the things that we're going to be bringing out and advocating for with governments in our work on the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. There's so much here. You know, I just kind of want, like, for each of you, just let the clock keep going, because it's just so rich and powerful. And I think you said something there that needs to be, for me at least, needs to be said again and again: root cause and full cycle. And Sharon, Judith, this is something we talked about. You know, well, we're going out and we're cleaning up and we're doing this, and that's great. We don't want to say that's not a thing, but it's kind of like when you're battling a hydra. You know, if we just keep on going after all these heads, it's just keep on popping up and popping up. And so we really need this focus, this laser focus on these root causes. And that's what we see with these bills that you're pushing. You know, Sharon, this is stopping it where it's starting. I think that's so much of these pieces. And one thing I kind of want to blend two questions I have, because I'm looking at time, and somehow we've already gone through 40 minutes. Is this question on, because this is daunting, right? There's, I think, one thing that I want to talk a little bit more later is this question of power and money. This industry is very wealthy and they're very well connected. And so there's this piece, and as an individual, where you say, well, what can I do? And I think what you all have done is you built incredible coalitions, or you're a part of incredible coalitions. And so, Casey, I want to ask you, you know, in the work that you do of, you know, working in coalitions, what's worked well? What helps you keep these coalitions grounded? And what's maybe something that you hasn't worked, but you've learned from that to really help keep communities in the space being active and continuing in this work and in this fight?
Boy, this is fun to listen to, and it's inspiring to really get some deep thoughts going on everything. And of course, I would also like to mention that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can also make a difference. I was one of 24 that of Indigenous people who had input into the UN Conference on Climate Change this year. And it has given us a bit of hope that even though this has been signed on to, it still needs to be implemented, which gives us the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And what I want to remind everyone is that we, as Indigenous people, we of Turtle Island, and I do appreciate some of you mentioning the occupied territory that you're on, and who it formerly belonged to before the colonial government came in and deliberately removed us from our homeland. So thank you for that. Also want to say that within our sovereignty, which doesn't always be as sovereign as we'd like it to be. We are making some inroads. When I was on the tribal council, we were able to pass a rights of nature statute. And the rights of nature statute is put in place so that we can hold those people who are inflicting environmental genocide on us culpable for their crimes. How do we say that you can pollute the sacred rivers and the sacred deer, the fish, the birds, the water, and the humans, without saying that you're also a criminal for doing so, and we will prosecute you in our own tribal courts? And when we do that, we also protect the people around us. Sharon was speaking about the cattle there. Those cattle are owned by people who are trying to help feed us all. And so when we pass the rights of nature statute, we're protecting the forelegs, the fins. We're protecting the ranchers, the farmers that live around us as well. I'd also like to mention that we put a moratorium on fracking and injection wells in our territory, which again protects our neighbors around us and stops some of the plastics at its source. So one of the things I'd like to just say to you is that some of these things are intertwined to such a degree that when people like us get together and put our minds and spirits into alignment, and we begin to align human law with natural law, then we do make the headway, and we have a finite amount of time to do so. We can no longer talk and have studies about what's going on. If the governor had the wind blow into his direction, he got a taste of what we have been saying for a long time. It may begin with us, but you're not immune to the winds blowing and the water flowing. We are all live downstream. We all live downwind from one another. And it is these few people that are at the top of the food chain in the oil and gas and extractive industry that are holding the entire world hostage, just like you saw Twitter being bought by a multi-billionaire. Those billionaires who are controlling the top, and thank you, Sharon, for going to the Bank of America. We're doing a lot of divestment work as well. And insurers, the insurers also need to be called out in those ways. But we need to be able to put all of these things into one basket, as we're doing today, and support each other in those areas that we're capable of supporting one another. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you so much. Sharon, I wanted to point the same question to you in this coalition work. I saw, you never intended to be an environmentalist, right? But this is something that you are now, because you can't help but be. And so in this work, and I know you've got to run in 15, so I'm going to pair two of my questions for you together. And ask for a little graciousness on time for this, for you to go a little bit longer. But one, what's really worked for you in building out these coalitions? And then, and this is something we said off the top, right? There's a lot of joy that needs to happen in this work. And when I see you speaking and talking, there's an energy about you behind your eyes that drives you there. And so I'm curious, like, where is that deep well for you? And then how do you deal with those sad times, those tearful times? There's sometimes I tell my wife in this work, I'm just sad today because I need to be sad. And I know it's not forever, but there are times I just need to be sad. And so how does your faith, your spirituality, these pieces all come together to inform what you're doing and keeping you in it?
Well, first of all, it's because of faith that I started doing the work that I'm doing. There's no way I would have gotten into this without God. He's the force that drove me to do what I'm doing. And he spoke to me. He spoke to me, talked to me, and told me what to do. And whenever I feel sad, I open up my Bible and I read the 37th Psalm. And that's uplifting, that it helps me. And sometimes when people criticize me, I pray for them because they are the one that needs the help. The people that don't realize that they are being poisoned. And we try to build up our organization. We try to educate the public on what's going on because they don't know, just like I didn't know. All these years I lived in St. James, I didn't know I was being poisoned until I went to the doctor in 2016 and found out that I had autoimmune hepatitis. Then I found out I had aluminum in my blood. Then I found out I had lead in my blood. So I'm being treated for all those things, but I'm still here. And God is the answer in everything that we do. We have to put him first and put him in what we're doing. And we can't do it by ourselves. We had to join with other organizations and we formed a coalition. Jane is a part of that. We had fun together. We did marches. We did so many things. Jane even came to speak in St. James for different things. And she told us all about plastic, how plastic is in our bodies. I didn't know it was that bad. And I was glad to be educated on what's going on. And I'm still learning. I'm still finding out more about what's going on because we've been doing it for 3.5 years. And look how much we have grown and how much we have learned and how we're trying to fight this. And the bad thing I think about it, the awful thing that I think about is our politicians. They don't try to help us. They vote for industry. They say these industries bring jobs and they put food on the table. But I say, why should you have a job that's going to poison you and cut off your life? You might live 25 years longer if you didn't have all of this pollution. So the politicians need to get away from these, with this myth about we have to have food. If we didn't have this industry that's polluting our soil, we would make our own gardens. Like when I grew up, we had our own gardens. Now you plant something, it's not healthy anymore because the ground is polluted. So we have to educate the people. That's number one, education. I educated myself when I started to do this. And just like I said, God is my rock. I stand on him. I couldn't do it without him. So I encourage other people to get on board and let's work together and continue, but bring God with you. And whenever we go on a march, whenever we do things, whenever we speak, bring God with us. Talk to the politicians. They are the ones that's voting for these industries to come in here. So we need to stand together. One of our politicians said we should sit at the table and talk with Formosa Plastics and see what we can come up with. I said, oh my God, he's lost. Poor thing. We need to pray for him because he voted for the plants to come here and poison us. He said God told him to vote yes. Well, how come God told me to vote no? So I mean, not vote, but I don't vote, but I'm just saying he told me to fight the plant that's trying to come in here. So I don't know which one, who you think is lying, me or him? Because I don't think God told anyone to pollute us. I stand on my word and I'm believing what God told me to do. And that's the way.
Thanks, Sharon. There's this piece, right, of faith and religion that, and this is where it can, and I think for me, like I said at the beginning, I am confident that the way through this, the way that we get forward is by leaning on these traditions, on these wisdoms, but also knowing full well the pollution of our thoughts and our minds, this toxicity that seeps in, and the way that religion can be used and is used as a cudgel to keep people down. And I think we need to keep that front and center. And I'm so glad you said what you said, Sharon, because there is that piece that we need to hold in tension as we do this work. And we need to keep lifting that up. And so thank you for that. And whenever you need to run, please do. It's been such a joy, and know that we've got your back.
I'm not ready to run. There. I'm not ready to go yet. I'm not going to leave till about 12:15 because they're going to come and get me around 12:15. So I'm not ready to go. I want to listen to this. This is interesting.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're going to keep it moving then.
Okay.
I want to turn to you, Judith, with this question about what's worked, because what you've put together with Beyond Plastics, is to me so inspiring. And so what for you really worked as you're, developing out at this larger federal level across states and with all these different folks?
Well, a couple things. One is pointing out the intersection of all the issues related to plastics. So one thing we have been working a lot on is educating the public, the media, and policymakers on how plastics is a climate change issue. And I've been wanting to hold up this report, our whole session here, that we issued called The New Coal, Plastics and Climate Change. And you'll see that lovely picture of Sharon on the cover. She gave us permission to use this photo of her standing defiantly against Formosa. And this report was my idea, maybe a year ago, because it was kind of obvious that the fossil fuel industry was losing their market share for energy production and transportation, because we're finally shifting to energy efficiency, clean renewables, and then electrifying cars, trucks, buses, etc. So plastic production is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. That is their big multi-billion-dollar shift, trying to build ethane cracker facilities all over the country, mostly Louisiana, Texas, and Appalachia. And as Casey Camp mentioned, ethane, a byproduct of hydrofracking, is now the major ingredient of plastics along with chemicals. So I think the key in coalition is to bring in people who are interested in every step of the plastic problem. What I find really interesting and inspiring is the role of women leaders on this issue. So it's within organizations. Also, I teach a class on plastic pollution. I used to teach it to, 25 above average liberal arts students at Bennington College in person, and then which was great. But when COVID hit, we decided to shift the class to Zoom. So it's a 7-week class on plastic pollution. About a third college students taking it for credit, or actually less than that. And then most of the people taking the class are auditing it, and they're community people. Over 95% of the people who've enrolled in my class over the last 5 semesters identify as female. These are women who are in their communities, thirsty for information and wanting to work in coalition to reduce plastic pollution. And I'm really inspired by that. A problem is within the environmental community worldwide, we're in silos. So, the land conservation people typically don't talk to the toxics people. The water pollution people don't talk to the air pollution people. And even within the anti-plastics movement, there's a little bit of division. There's the oceans people, and there are always these people who are very blonde, who are out on sailboats, sailing around the world. Like, who has time for that? And then they see all the plastic in the ocean and they come back and say, oh my gosh, that's a problem. We've got to do something. I welcome that. That's a different life experience and different approach of people breathing in benzene and formaldehyde and lead and aluminum and cadmium every day. It's also different from people who are just looking at how do you reduce plastic in your personal life. So, and I do want to talk about, yes, we all make really important choices as consumers, but we need systemic change. So again, in my class, every semester now, it's the same. The beginning of the class, people are piping up with great examples of how to reduce your own use of plastic. How do you make your own yogurt? What's deodorant that doesn't come in a plastic tube, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of patiently wait, and we share all the information. And then I gently say, we're looking for systemic change here. We want you and your family not to have plastics in your blood and in your house, but it's a lot bigger. And then by the end of the semester, people are like, where do we go to the rally to shut down Formosa? not how do I make my own yogurt to avoid plastic. So, and we have to kind of welcome that. It's a progression. When I started teaching the class, I had a hard time finding current information. There's no textbook on plastic pollution. Now I'm buried in really good reports on the petrochemical build out, scientific peer-reviewed articles, one out of Italy last January or January before, identifying microplastics in human placenta, the maternal side and the fetal side. Information on alternatives to plastics. We have the information. What we don't have is the political power to affect change, either in the boardroom or in the courtroom or in the halls of Congress and state legislatures, but we are getting there. Today, Sharon focusing on financing of Formosa is incredible. We need lawsuits. We need new laws, and we need budgets to enforce the law. That is what joyfully working in coalition will get us. And there's got to be some joy involved, because we all know people who we work with who I get calls all the time from people wanting to work on plastic, and I try to be respectful and respond to everyone. And when the call starts with, "Oh, I'm glad to get you. I've been working on this for years. I'm getting nowhere. Everyone's terrible. There's no way to win. It's insurmountable. Do you want to work with me?" No, you're no fun at all. I'm depressed from 2 minutes on the phone with you. So how do we keep focus on effective strategies, supporting each other? And it's serious stuff. The stakes are high, but we also need to find a little bit of joy in what we do, or you just don't last. And then my final point is, and I'm not being partisan at all, but the presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren, used a phrase that I think is so relevant to this work. She persisted. And that's how we're going to win. She is going to keep persisting.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you so much. That joy piece, yes, absolutely. And so with that, to you, Jane, the same question. What have you seen that works? And your negotiation, you're working with local communities, you're working across countries, you're working with member state, so how, for you, what's been effective? What lessons maybe have you learned from some of the stuff that you've been doing there in Louisiana to help create an effective coalition?
I'm going to say something really basic. You have to feed people. You have to feed them on multiple fronts. I see Sharon, because we've shared so many meals together, literal meals of food. You literally, if you want people to come to a meeting, you have to feed them. And that is something that we forget all the time, that coalition work is about meeting people's needs in order to be part of a community. And y'all, throughout human history, the best way to form community is through food. And that is a communal space. It's meeting a human need that everybody has to have. And it creates an opportunity for you to talk about your grandmothers and for you to talk about your ancestral recipes and how you make your etouffee or your gumbo, or these are the things I know from Louisiana. When I first married my husband, his mother asked if I could make a roux, which I think is hilarious and tells you how Louisiana we are. And I think that food is such an important part of not just creating the space and creating community, but literally, we're asking folks to show up for these meetings outside of their workday if we're doing it right. And if you're meeting in the evening with local folks, you got to feed them. And also you have to have childcare. Like you have to, if you want people to come to a meeting, you have to make sure that their basic needs are met. And I know that I'm like in the weeds talking about specifics. And I'm not just talking about women, because everybody cares for children. And if you have small children at home, it is difficult to come to a meeting. And yet, folks, parents are some of the most invested people you want in this space, because they are going to fight. They're going to be great advocates. And I'm not just speaking because I am one, and I think actually all of the women on this call are, but it's important that we think about how we are bringing family and community together. And y'all, kids get it. They get it. And they're going to be mouthpieces, and they're going to be advocates. And bringing kids to a community meeting, the best way to create adults who value community and advocacy is to get them started as children. So I just can't enforce how much your meetings, your spaces need to be informative. They need to be educating. They need to be all the things that everybody's already said. And they also need to be spaces of family and community and joy. And nothing brings joy to a meeting like a 3-year-old. I'm just saying. And I think and I think that that's a lesson that's true even when we're doing this global coalition work around the treaty. Anytime we meet to work on the treaty, we go to these meetings, whether they're in Senegal or Nairobi or Bangkok, we always have a pre-meeting. We meet the day before, and that meeting is always centered around a meal. And it's something that we just fight for. And the community that is built, the trust we build with one another, that trust is not built over a PowerPoint presentation. That trust is not built over the specifics of a policy or one page of a 1,000-page bill or resolution. And it's not built over the specifics of language that gets into a treaty or not into a treaty. The community, the trust is built over the time that we spend laughing together, and the time that we spend praying together, and the time that we spend eating together. And those are all extremely important spaces. I was raised in a spiritual tradition. I was raised Unitarian in Louisiana, which is uncommon to say the least. It's a very Catholic area. It's a very Christian area. And so I am coming at this from a very different spiritual space. And yet Sharon and I pray together at the beginning of every meeting. I think I saw Pastor Joseph walking around in the background. He's usually the one who leads our prayers and meeting. And that is so important that we have these meetings that start with prayer. I even attended a meeting last week that was a meeting of countries in the Pacific, and they started their meeting with prayer. And that, even if we don't start with prayer, we start with a breath. We take a minute, we put our feet flat on the floor, we close our eyes, and we just breathe together. That is the ways that we are creating community. Even if you come from radically different traditions, even if you have nothing else that unites you, we are united as humans who have to eat, who have to drink, who usually frequently have children. These are all things that we unite around and things we develop trust around. And there's no way to develop trust like telling somebody's mama that you can make a roux. And I think that's really important.
I really want to have your roux now. I don't think I've ever had roux, which
I mean, it's a base for sauce. You don't eat it by itself. It's fine.
Okay,
it's fine.
great. Well, anyways, we'll still want it. Come on over to Portland. It'll be great. We'll host you. We almost got my daughter in here. She's 2. She's wonderful. Her name's Maya. We were so close, but next time. And there's this thing, right? And it was brought up earlier around metrics versus living is what I wrote down. And I think that's a lot of the approach to this work is how many hectares are we saving? What's the carbon count? What are all these things? And those are tough to get around. But when you're in this space, when you're with people, this is what matters. This is the thing that makes us whole and motivates us. And so Sharon, for this last piece, and we're in a time, so I'm going to be a little bit more diligent on my stopwatch in here. Got about 4 minutes on this. But Sharon, this piece of heritage, and I think one of the things that really broke my heart and continues to break my heart is just the digging up of the ancestral graves, right, to place these spots. And it's not just, with slaves, the indigenous people who lived there, this complete disrespect, the cowardice that it would take for a person to think that this is okay. It's just shocking to me. And so as in this work, this heritage piece, for you, I'm just curious, like where does this heart piece around heritage, around our ancestors, and how do we hold on to that story of that hope towards the future for these next 7 generations, as you were saying, Casey.
So you're asking me?
Yeah, over to you, Sharon. Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. When we found out about the grave site on Formosa's property that they purchased, they did not inform our parish officials that there were grave sites out there until we did a records request through our attorneys. And an archaeologist from Baton Rouge, Don Hunter, he informed us for sure that there were grave sites. We had an idea that it was. And then we went to the parish council meeting. I never forget that. December 23rd, 2019, I read the letter letting them know about the grave sites. And it was 3 different grave sites out there. But the bigger one was the one called Buena Vista. And after we announced it to the parish council members, Formosa still didn't acknowledge it, that there were graves out there until later on. They said they found human skull and human bones. And the graves they've been, I guess, sugarcane farmers planted over those graves. So all they have is the flat land with grass growing on top of it. And then Formosa, they put a partial fence around where the grave site is. And it was heartbreaking just to know that there were grave sites there, and they were planning to desecrate what was left of the remains of our ancestors. And they told us that we can't prove that that's our ancestors. And we told them that they couldn't prove that it wasn't our ancestors. And then we asked to have a meeting out there to celebrate the knowledge about our ancestors being buried there. They denied us that access. So we went to court on a Thursday, and our Juneteenth event was that Friday. The judge ruled in our favor. They still went to a higher court that same day, and the judge ruled in our favor. So that next day we had our Juneteenth. And as we went on the property, went on the grave site, you could feel the presence of the ancestors. You could feel the spirit that they were glad that we did this and that we thought enough about them to save what was left of their graves. And it was such a wonderful feeling. It just touched my heart, because it just like they were telling us, thank you for doing this. And it was so wonderful. Then the next time we had it, the bishop from Baton Rouge came for All Saints, and he did a commemoration of the graves, and it was wonderful. And we had so many ministers there, and they joined in and prayed, and we sang. It was so nice. So we just can't forget our ancestors, because we know that that's our ancestors that are buried there. It's right there in St. James in the 5th district. It was called Welcome at one time. So it's just like a part of us is there. And we just can't, we can't forget about it. We just can't. And so that was our fight. And so far, nothing had been done with the gravesite. They left it alone after that. But we have a tie to these people that's buried there.
Right. Tie to the people, a tie to the land, those stories. And I think that's something that we can't forget, is those stories and why we're there and why we don't leave. And I think, that sense of like, why not just pick up and go? Well, this is our right. This is our story. This is our land. This is our heritage. And, this fundamental right of being alive, of being able to eat and drink is right there. And I think that memory of knowing all the people that came before, and that for me inspires all that's to come, and I think it's that memory and that story. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And so I'll be leaving right now, but it was nice to be on here with you all, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon.
Bye, Jane.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
And so to close things out, we've only got a little bit more time. So I'm going to start with you, Jane, go to Judith and Casey. If you can close us out, I'd be so grateful. But Jane, there's something, because and this is a conversation we had, I said, resistance is the first step to restoration. And you challenged that. You said, what reparation is so important in this work. And I think there's part of this heritage piece and what what Sharon was kind of leaving off there. So can you say a little bit more on that point of these reparations, of what's happened in the past and why we need to address it if we're going to move forward?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. The very first conversation Andrew and I ever had, we ended up crying together. And it was just this incredibly moving conversation about all of the ways that this place that we call home, among other places, well, that I call home and Sharon calls home, have been ravaged and hurt. And, you know, it's how permanent is the damage? We don't know, but we haven't tried to fix the damage yet meaningfully. There have been some government programs to do so, but not nearly enough. You know, and we really support the work to return land to Indigenous groups. You know, this is the land back movement and recognition. And but the question is, in what condition? You know, are we talking about returning land in a condition that is healthy, in a condition that is livable? Like we're barely asking that question. And, you know, are we asking the questions about who the people were who were buried in the Buena Vista site on the what is right now land owned by Formosa and planned for this facility? Even if we can't figure out exactly who they are, right? Their descendants live in Louisiana. There is an undeniable, very unfortunately well-documented history of exploitation and harm and murder and death in this country. And we have to be talking about how we both restore the damage that we've done to the earth and how we make up for the unpaid labor, for the harm, for the loss, for the separation of families that we have done, for the removal from homelands that we have done of many, many large groups of people around the world. There is a debt that is owed. And simply talking about sovereignty, while important, is not making up the debt spiritually or financially. And it's important that we have that conversation. And right now, so much of our international structure is actually focused around the people who we should be indebted to, instead being indebted to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And what I just said might have gotten me in a little bit of trouble, and I'm going to say it anyway, because we are actually expecting the people who we should be honoring and paying back to instead pay back to us. And I think that is wildly inappropriate. And I think that is a system that should be absolutely revisited and turned around and decolonized in a way that I'm not even sure we're ready to have that conversation. But if we talk about how we alleviate poverty and how we address inequality, you know, you alleviate poverty by not allowing people to be poor. And, you know, we feed, again, this is back to the issue of feeding people and housing them and ensuring that everyone has dignity and has clean air and has clean water. There is a debt that is owed. And right now, our entire financial, economic, political system is not built around repaying that debt. And that's a serious conversation we have to have. That is not specific to the United States. That is true, you know, in the relationship between Europe and many African nations. That is true in the relationship between Europe and the United States and many South American nations. That is true in the relationship between the United States and other countries, in addition to the United States and its own peoples, whether those are people that are actually its citizens or also its citizens and citizens of other sovereign nations within the borders of the United States. We have to be having a conversation about reparations and about paying back debt. And there have been some studies, there have been movements to, you know, figure out what that debt could be and what it could look like. And we're not there yet, and we're not moving on it. And to your point, Andrew, yes, the resistance is the first step toward restoration. And I firmly believe reparation is the first step to resistance. And maybe that's why it hasn't been done yet, right? But we have to meet people. We have to meet people's needs.
There was a conversation I was having last year for the Food System Summit, and we were talking about the Virgin Islands and the disassociation, real contempt that so many people there have for the land, for farming. And one of our speakers, Dr. Ludus Pearson, said, after so many years of colonization, slavery, the people in the Virgin Islands, look at the land as a scene of the crime. And so I think this deep-seated, it doesn't go away, and unless we're willing to reopen those old wounds, they'll never really heal. They'll just consider to fester. And it's this, how do we learn to ask better questions and the right questions to meet the moment so that we're actually solving for the things that need to be solved? And so, Judith, I want to move to you on this question of power. And it's something we talked about. There is this internal piece, there's this heart piece, there's this community piece, but there's also just real power. And so for you, and you said a little bit earlier, but why are these laws, why are these lawsuits, why are these policies so important in this question of power?
Yeah, we don't say the P word a lot. We have to talk about power and political power. Who has it? Why do they have it? How do we get it? Because that is what changes the quality of life for everyone, including the planet. So when it comes to the plastics issue, there is a tremendous power imbalance. The United States has 4% of the world's population. The United States uses 17% of the world's energy. We gobble up 24% of the world's natural resources. And then, not surprisingly, we create 12% of the world's solid waste. And when it comes to getting rid of the solid waste, it's usually at landfills or incinerators. Both are very polluting, almost always located in low-income communities and communities of color. So that's the backdrop. And then you enter the state legislature, the city council, Congress, and you try to do some really modest things like, let's keep it simple. Let's talk about banning plastic bags. A modest proposal, we can use reusable bags. It saves people money. New York State, for instance, residents of New York use 23 billion plastic bags a year. When we passed a law to ban plastic bags, all you know what broke loose. The plastic bag industry sued. The state agency messed up the regulations. They're still not fully enforcing the law in New York City. And a lot of that is because plastics is represented by the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, the plastics industry. So what Jane and I do by day is we read these really compelling reports about the ecological and health damage caused by plastic, well documented. And then you get in the arena and you're met with an army of lobbyists from places like the American Chemistry Council. Everyone should know about the American Chemistry Council. Google them. They're a force in Washington. They're in every state legislature. They either have one or two lobbyists in state legislatures. Sometimes they have one for Republican legislators and one for Democratic legislators. And
at the United Nations.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And UN worldwide. And so they get up every morning with the goal of blocking progress. And they are very politically powerful. And they lower expectations on what you can and can't do, and they block good policies. So how do you deal with something like that? Well, you elect good people to office, easier said than done, because we don't have public campaign financing. So you've got these same special interests also making campaign contributions through PACs. You hold legislators accountable. You educate the public by talking to the media. Harder to do because look at your own community. You may have once had 3 daily newspapers. Maybe you have 1 now, and you have very few investigative reporters. So it's hard to get the information out. And, quite honestly, it's amazing we get anything done because the power imbalance is huge. But we have facts, and we have a very interested and engaged public. People really care about reducing plastic pollution. And the issue has progressed in the last even 18 months. I worry all the time about plastics in the ocean, but I agree that's not the way to frame it. People are looking at production, use, and disposal. But I often feel like I'm in a parallel universe. You know, I'll read a compelling report, and then I have a meeting with a state legislator who was just lobbied by the plastics industry. And you have to patiently unravel all of the misinformation. And quite honestly, we're not getting done what needs to be done. We're just not. So even though my group, Beyond Plastics, is a feisty little environmental startup with 6 staff. Don't tell anyone we're only 6 because we act like we're bigger. And what we've decided to do is really shift a lot of our attention to grassroots organizing. And we are helping to set up local Beyond Plastic groups or affiliates. We don't want to step on toes. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's a local group working on plastics, we want to be an affiliate with them. So we don't have funding to do this, but we're dedicating about a third of our staff time to doing this, because we have to build the grassroots movement against plastics and for alternatives to plastics from the bottom up. So investing in the reuse, refill economy as an alternative to plastic. It's going to be a big fight. And we need faith leaders involved. We need community people of all stripes. And in the end, we will succeed. It'll be incremental, which is a problem, because as the climate activist Bill McKibben says, winning slowly is losing. We can't win slowly on climate change. We can't win slowly on plastics because the damage is so severe. So building that grassroots movement and marrying it to smart policy reforms, I think will result in success.
Thanks so much, Judith. I agree. And I think that grassroots, that community, for me, is that key, because one person is very small, but together we can be strong. And so thank you for that. And Casey, I would love to hand it over to you and kind of have some closing reflections. And I want to come back to something you said at the very beginning. And I just wrote down with an exclamation mark, we are nature. And I think that is a piece that I think is lost in this conversation. And so, for you, why is this restoration piece, that fundamental fact so important into this work, not only of fighting plastic pollution and waste, but looking at ecosystem restoration as a whole?
I think that the interconnectedness of all life has been something that I've been hearing throughout the conversations today. When Jane was talking about her fundamental organizing understandings, that's very grassroots. That's what we do. My brother Carter, who was a leader of the American Indian movement, called it kitchen table organizing. Within our family structure and within our people, it always begins around the kitchen table. And then we expand that into our community and beyond and beyond and beyond. So it is also that kind of understanding is why I'm working so intensely on rights of nature. I work primarily with Movement Rights, which is a small Indigenous-led women's group that is doing intertribal rights of nature forum, as well as we're working with GARN, the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature. Because human beings have somehow, through ego, come to believe that they are separate from nature, that You know, today I was watching something about consciousness on TV, and they were talking about how plants respond in a Pavlovian way and to certain stimulus. And of course, that's true. And it's something within the indigenous cosmology that we've always understood. And when we talk about power, we're talking about the kind of power that is transient right now. We're not talking about what real power is. The true powers that we're dependent on is the Father, Son, is the Moon Mother and her rhythms, is the sacred water. It is the power of life itself that is part of us because we eat those plants, because we eat that meat and the fish, and because we breathe that air that has existed from time immemorial, just as the sacred water has. So it is a inclusionary answer that 30 different countries, including Panama recently, including Chile, the Ponca Nation, the Wanganui River in New Zealand, and on, have begun to utilize this tool, this understanding of rights of nature. That's simply saying we have to look beyond human rights when we talk about this, just like plastic has to be associated with the petroleum industry, or else we're not looking at the complete entire story. For humans to be able to make a way forward, we must be able to recognize that we are nature in this so-called fight, in this awareness that we are nature protecting itself, and therefore rights of nature is a very smart thing for us to look at as part of the way that we do realign natural law with human law. And for those who consider themselves power, they will go into the earth the same way as you and I, the same way as the buffalo does, the same way as the stars twinkle above us. These things move in a natural law, regardless of what humans do. Recognize true power, recognize the rights of nature, and within that, recognize that we as humans have a very short time to align ourselves. And thank you all. It's been a pleasure being among you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined in this conversation today in the chat for bringing this together. I know, Casey, as you were finishing up, I was thinking of an event we did earlier at the Center for Earth Ethics that my boss and the founder, Corinna Gore, put together on ecocide, and really looking at these legal mechanisms that can get us there around the rights of nature. And I just love how you said real power versus transient power. I think that is something that so many of us would do well to heed, of what actually moves, what actually matters. And I think that's, again, why we wanted to talk about this through this lens of values, culture, and spirituality. What does matter? What keeps us going? And how do we organize around that? And I just love this kitchen table organizing, this common food, so much of it. Grove, humility is key. Absolutely. And so as I close out, and we're only going to go over like a minute, I promise, I just want to plug that this is in fact a series, and this is all interconnected and interrelated. And we want to start with air and this problem of plastic pollution, what's going on in St. James Parish, for that reason, because ecosystem restoration is a process, all different bumps along the same log. And so as we're looking at this resistance piece, we're in our next conversation going to look at what's happening in India along the river Yamuna. The river Yamuna is one of India's most sacred rivers. It's closely connected to the stories of the Hindu deity Krishna, and the Yamuna is venerated and worshipped by Hindus worldwide. Despite this, and this is this problem, that we talk about, faith, religion, how does this all interact and interconnect? Despite the fact that this is such a sacred river, as soon as it goes through Delhi, it's then considered dead because all the pollution, the waste, the chemicals that go into it. And so we're in a few weeks' time, and I'm going to put this in the chat before I forget. If you're not already part of the center's mailing list, please send us a note, sign up so that we can inform you about when this next one's going to happen. It's going to be in May, and we're going to bring together some faith leaders, some thought leaders, some scientists to have this conversation about what's working along the River Yamuna. How are we digging into our faith and spiritual traditions to bring around the change that we need to see? And how do we do this in community for the health of the people and the planet and all these pieces? So again, thank you. Thank you. Also just want to say my mom's in the chat, which is really exciting. Hi, Mom. So glad you woke up to be in this. And thank you to everyone who was here. Such a gift. This will be available online. I'll email you guys. I'll try not to send too many emails after this, but just thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. Such an honor to be in your company, and just look forward to continuing being this work with you all wherever you are. So thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Hope you get some good food. So long.